Hello, Dr. Ron England, coming to you from Daytona State College, and today we're going to explain something that actually confuses many of my students, this concept of delegates and delegates, not delegates, but delegates in C# programming. And I'm just going to explain it from a practical level. I've got a console application here that I'm going to show you, and I've made it as simple as I possibly can. So first, let's look at the code. I've created this class called sample object. I've got two constructors, two properties. The properties are name and valid. Now, you are going to be able to show me a lot of other ways to do this specific example without using delegates, but I created it to demonstrate the concept of delegates. So essentially, I've got two constructors here, one with name and valid. Okay, valid is going to be a Boolean, so there's my properties Boolean, and I created a method called nameIsValid, which returns the property valid. Now, realizing that in a more complex situation, you may actually have a tremendous amount of logic here. But the bottom line is I'm going to have a method in this class that returns a Boolean based on information that is contained in the class. So hopefully you can kind of see beyond this simple example to the bigger complexities of dealing with classes and what we might be able to do with this. Simple, sample object, two properties, name and valid, and one method, nameIsValid, that returns the status of whether the name is valid. Now, this is a console application, so we're just going to use this to demonstrate how to use this. Now, the example I'm using here is going to be about as simple as I possibly can make it. I am going to create a list of these sample objects. So right here, I create a list of sample objects called list. And then I add two sample objects to the list, name1 and name2 for the names, and false and true for the valid variables. So name1 is false, name2 is true. Again, just an example used to demonstrate the complexity. Now, I'm going to write a couple of simple methods to demonstrate, and ignore the console writes. You need those to actually see the output. The console write here, I actually take the object, the list object, my list, and I use the first method, which is built in, and bring back the name. Let's run this just to see it. Okay, so I need to bring the console over so you can see it, and if you look up there, you'll see that name1, if I hit enter, and it's going to be name2. We haven't seen what those do yet, but let's look at those. So basically, the list, if I call the first method of the list and return the name, I can see the name of the first element in the list. Easy. Now, let's get into where we can use some delegates. One of the other methods of the list calls for a function. So in other words, and that function needs to return a Boolean. The purpose of this function in this one of these methods first, which actually accepts the function, is so that you can actually have a function that returns the first specific element in the list, like the first, in our case, valid element in the list, getting rid of the other ones. But remember that since it accepts a function, it can be any function that basically has a conditional, so that you can filter the list, okay, using a function. But now we've got a little bit of a complexity here. In the list, if I want to call this first method, I want to call it, but I want to pass it the function, the method that is used to determine the validity. Enter delegates. Okay, so let's look at this. And so now I've done this twice. These both do exactly the same thing. So console write you can ignore. I have my list object, which is, by the way, a list, and I call the first. This first takes an argument. Okay, the argument is a function. Okay, now here's where I got some complexities here. Because this is a list, and I need to look at the objects within the list, and I actually specifically need to look at a method of the objects in the list and see if it evaluates to true or false, I need some way of pointing to the individual objects in the list. In other words, I need something to delegate the operation to. Syntax, I'm going to give you two syntaxes. One's the Lambda syntax, and one is the full syntax. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a delegate of the sample objects. Okay. So in this case, I actually declare delegate. Sample object SO. Give it a name. Now, the conditional of the SO is the function name is valid. I can return whether the delegated object in the list returns a true or a false in the name is valid, and that entire piece will return has the ability to give back the name. If you think about what we're doing here, we're actually figuring out how to pass a method into the actual method first. Because the method, I'm actually using a function to do this. So the concept of delegate is right there. Now, for those of you who are in JavaScript programming and are very used to just simply saying, well, if you got a function, just pass it to the function. And then call it within the function and see what happens. A little bit more complex when you're outside of JavaScript. That syntax for that is relatively straightforward. But conceptually, what you are doing is you're saying, I am going to use a method of an object in the list which returns a Boolean which is necessary for the first method of the list itself, and I'm going to get the output. And that's what this syntax does. Now, that's some relatively complex syntax there. So if we look at the concept of a Lambda expression, which does exactly the same thing, we now have the first method, which is the first of sample objects. Okay, my delegate parameter SO. I call the SO name as valid equals true. And yes, you're going to immediately state that I don't need the equals true because name is valid returns a Boolean in the first place. Yes. However, okay, unless you're sticking to a very fixed naming convention, using is valid being always returning a Boolean, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and have the equals true because it allows people that are looking at the code to understand, yes, this is the conditional that I'm actually looking at. Okay, if is this true or equal to false? Because I can also very quickly, if I run this, okay, and I have the name 1, which we saw was the first call, and then name 2 and name 2, both of the situations where it was valid. Well, guess what I can do here? That was my filter. What if I change it to false? I want to return the first one that has a false. Okay, if I run this again, console comes up. I bring it over, name 1, and this time it's name 1, and we're done. That simple. So I know that working with delegates and the Lambda expressions can be relatively complex, but to simplify, think of it this way. If you need to pass a method to a method to determine something, delegates are the way to get that done. And that's the simple part of it. Thank you very much, and good programming.